It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. In 2005, filmmaker Joel Anderson was attempting to acquire funding for a screenplay he wrote, and that required a significant budget he didn't have the money for at the time. So in order to try to raise the money for that project, he began working on the script for what would ultimately become two things: an extremely well-received found footage film, one that would become considered one of the best ever in the subgenre, and the only film he would end up directing. That film is 2008's Lake Mungo. Now, while Anderson would not direct another film, he would go on to become a script editor and executive producer on Late Night with the Devil, a movie I recently featured on Monster Mondays. Now, originally, the concept for Lake Mungo was strictly meant to be an examination of grief, and Anderson rejects the concept of this being a supernatural movie at all. He opted to make the movie as a pseudo-documentary format, mixing found footage and docufiction. Now, if you've never heard the term docufiction, that's something that is actually quite heavily used in true crime shows. It's the concept of having a documentary feel, usually through interviews with real people, mixed in with either fictional recreations or footage or something that kind of creates a more of a dramatic element around the story that's being told. Now, mixed into the concept of the film is Anderson's fascination of modern technology like camcorders, phones, and other things that made having cameras much more widespread. He sees things more easily documenting and remembering memories and experiences that people have, and that's becoming, even back then, 20 years ago, something that was already starting to grow that's now commonplace today. There are people taking pictures, videos of themselves. Basically, they are creating a visual diary of their existence, of their life, more so now than ever before in human history. Now, the script was only a basic outline with no real dialogue presented to the actors, and this is very much in the vein of the Blair Witch Project. The actors chosen are low profile, so the illusion of a more realistic documentary is intact during the course of the film. Although I don't think he ever intended for this to actually be seen as something realistic. It was just meant to feel more real and more like you did turn on an actual documentary. Now, while the film would end up only making about $30,000 at the box office next to its $1.7 million budget, the movie spent a couple of years getting released after, and getting shown through like film festival showings. So by 2010, Lionsgate and After Dark Films came along to get distribution rights, and the film would explode from there. The film's cult classic standing and high Rotten Tomatoes score, and not to mention the dozen or so high-profile lists it appears on as one of the best ever found footage films, it has pierced through to a lot wider audience and appreciation than most found footage movies. But I think we should go ahead and dive into Lake Mungo, shall we? The movie begins with the Palmer family: Russell, the father, June, the mother, and Matthew, the son. In 2005, the fourth member of the Palmer family, 16-year-old Alice, went missing. Matt and Alice were swimming that day, but she didn't follow him out of a dam in Ararat, Victoria, Australia. When searching for her, there was no indication that she ever actually left the dam. Her towel was still next to the water, and there just didn't seem to be any indication that she left or that there was any kind of a struggle or anything like that. And the family was basically sent home while the authorities continued their search. And later that night, Alice's body was discovered deep in the dam, and Russell identified her, saying that it was his responsibility as the father to do so. Over a week later, Alice was laid to rest, and another 10 days later, Russell explains noises started to be heard inside the Palmer home. Specifically, the noises came from Alice's room. So despite rehanging the door and having the room checked for termites and any other kind of physical sign of why there's noises coming from that area of the house, nothing seemed to stop the sounds. And by February, so another 2 weeks or so later, June began having terrifying nightmares about Alice. And the house began giving just about everyone who came there the heebie-jeebies. Russell, while sitting in Alice's room one night, claims to have seen Alice's ghost come into the room, sit down at her desk, and almost as if she wasn't even aware that he was there. And when she did realize that he was there, whatever this was of Alice kind of rushed him, and she became kind of agitated by her being found there. So Matthew decided to, that he needed to do something as well, because right after Alice's death, he began getting odd bruises on his body, and they showed up out of the blue and similarly disappeared just as spontaneously. So Matt began taking a keen interest in photography, and one of the things that he wanted to do, especially after this one special project he's been kind of working on for years, he decided that it would be a good idea to start setting up some cameras around the house just to see what was there. But this came because every few months for the past several years, he's taken a picture of the Palmer's backyard. And in April of 2006, his picture of the backyard revealed what appeared to be Alice standing against the fence. So earlier that same month, an image of a girl was captured at the dam where Alice drowned. June and Russell both began to doubt that the body he identified was indeed Alice. So they had her exhumed, and her body was tested with DNA. But it was confirmed that Alice did die, leaving the question who or what was in these photographs. Now, like I said, Matt decided to start setting up some video cameras. So he sets one up in Alice's room. And the very first night, he captured a dark, cloudy figure walking in the room. And June contacts a relatively famous psychic in Australia who goes by the name of Ray Kamini. Even though the general public opinion of Ray is divided, June wasn't quite sure who else to reach out to. So Ray decides it would be a good idea to hold a seance with the family. And in the videotaped seance, in the background, it appears that Alice is standing there, kind of present in the proceedings. Ray's continued presence in the lives of the Palmers kind of starts to raise a lot of questions, but constant video surveillance in the house has Alice show up again and again. Now, some more footage comes from a different couple who went to the dam, similar to that one other footage that I talked about previously. There was a local who had like a videotape of around the dam that appeared Alice was hanging out around the dam. But it's later determined that it's actually Matt wearing one of Alice's jackets. And he later fesses up to doctoring everything. And he talks about how he did it, how he was able to get Alice to appear in certain ways, how he double exposed certain pictures, or at least double developed pictures so that it would look like she was in the backyard. He talks about how he used an old family video to have her appear to show up in the seance and all of that by just having it play on TV and all of this. And it's kind of made clear that he kind of did this as a way to give his mother the closure that she never had when Alice's body was found. She was not willing to see the body before the funeral. She just didn't want her last image of Alice being in the state that she was in. However, later, when the home was completely empty, Matt left the video cameras running, and without any possibility of him or another member of the family doctoring anything, it is very clear that something looking like Alice was in the house after all. Now, upon looking back at all of the footage previously taken to see if any other image aside from what Matt put into the videotapes would appear, but actually there is something that is actually kind of shocking discovered in one of the videotapes. Now, in the video of Alice's room the first night that Matt set up anything, even though it was him kind of posing as something that could possibly be Alice, walking in the hallways, there was a second person who had snuck in and was kind of going through Alice's stuff, trying to find her safe where she kept a particular videotape. It was a neighbor who Alice had babysat for, and in this videotape it's shown that Alice engaged in a three-way with the man and his wife next door. They had left after Alice's death to ultimately avoid being discovered and prosecuted. But about 5 or 6 months ahead of her death, Alice reached out to Ray to ask if he could interpret her dreams. She had been having this recurring dream about drowning. Alice's boyfriend also comes to the Palmers with knowledge about a girl's trip to Lake Mungo and some footage that was on there. Alice, it's said later, or around, for this setup of the story, had gotten a cell phone to use to take videos during the trip and so on, but she came back without it, claiming that it was lost. However, other girls' videos showed Alice kind of distressed. At one point, she's walking off alone, and then it also shows in another video that where she was by herself, she looks like she's burying something. So the Palmers go to Lake Mungo to dig up whatever she buried, and June ultimately finds a plastic bag with various items that belong to Alice. When reviewing the video that Alice took on her phone, which was another one of the items in the bag, the Palmers discover Alice took a video of her kind of walking off alone along the shore of Lake Mungo, where she eventually took video of something approaching her. It was a ghostly image of Alice herself, her face resembling the way she looked when she was recovered from the lake. June realizes now that Alice knew that she was going to die, and the figure was like an omen, and Alice responded by burying personal items as if she was performing some sort of a ritual. June describes the feeling of the home after uncovering the phone, the truth about the neighbors, etc., as being calm, calmer than it had been since Alice died. She believes Alice wanted to tell her family who she was before she was dying. All the stuff about herself, the good, the bad, everything. And as time passes, a new sense of normality forms for the Palmers, and eventually they decide to sell their home. The final picture taken of the Palmers on their front lawn before leaving the house forever reveals Alice is still there in ghostly form looking out the window of her bedroom. Let's talk about 3 things I like about Lake Mungo. First, this is a wonderfully real feeling movie. It's difficult to provide interviews while playing a character and have it come off completely realized and realistic. So major kudos to all the actors here. You get how they feel. It's like they really are grieving the loss of a daughter. And as much as I always like the realism of, say, the Blair Witch Project, this is something completely different. This isn't really a found footage movie. Instead, it's a documentary, or that docufiction term. There isn't a scenario of someone keeping a camera rolling while they're running away, or keeping a camera rolling when no one in the world would think to do so when their life is in danger. This is a documentary. There is a reason to have a camera on, but it's asking the people in front of the camera to react to memories or thoughts, not something that's happening on screen with them. It's a really effective movie and keeps you pretty engrossed throughout it. Next, on the topic of grief and loss, that really is the main subject of this movie. Not the ghostly stuff, not the psychic, not the images of Alice's dead body as it was recovered from the bottom of the dam. This is about how a family deals with the loss of someone who would otherwise be happy and ready to live the rest of her life to the fullest. But this digs up a lot about Alice, and that's what I really like about it. She's a character who's always talked about in the past tense. That said, we know her, but sadly, it's only in other people's points of view. We know how much Matt misses her and how close the siblings were. We know how much her father adored and loved her, how he was so protective of her, but we never get her perspective of how she feels about Matt or Russell. It was Russell's, as I mentioned earlier, it was Russell's own belief that it was his sole responsibility to identify her body, to prevent his wife from having to deal with that. But we also learned some really sad things about Alice. She was never that close with her mother, which I think is kind of the thing that kind of bubbles up. This is really about the relationship between a mother and a daughter who weren't very close. And now one of them is gone and there's nothing you can do about it now. But it's said at the very beginning and it's repeated towards the end that Alice was very secretive. It was as if she was a different person around each other person in her life. And as I just said, there's no real way to reconcile any of that. The only way Russell and June could reconcile anything about losing Alice was that her relationship with the neighbors prevented her from being able to open up to whatever negative things were going on in her life. Those are very real things people do to process terrible events when it's too late to help or, after someone passes away or whatever. But lastly, let's talk about that ghost story angle of this movie. This is not a horror film. This is not a spooky movie necessarily. This is about one's fear of death and the other people in that person's life, fear of losing that person. This is, there is one really good scare in the movie, and, it's symbolic of why Alice's final months of her life were kind of full of sadness, which is what we learn most about. We don't necessarily see too much about all the happy times of her much younger youth. It's about the times leading up to her death. But her death seemingly was kind of unavoidable, and that she was not going to be alive much longer. She did the best she could to deal with that, but in the end, she was going to leave a hole in the lives of her family. And that said, there is an existential horror, I suppose, that is about, I guess, as realistic as it can possibly be. Death is the monster that stalks you from the moment you're born. While the movie deals more with the horror of losing a young member of the family and the sadness that comes with that, in the final act of the movie, we learned that Alice lived her final days knowing that she was going to die soon. The monster that is death was going to pop up and take her. While it's not really focused upon at all, I think she knew she was going to drown in the dam. And I'm pretty sure it's mentioned that, Matt was told to go on without her, or at least he assumed that she was hanging back and staying in the water to enjoy the water while he made his way back to where the family was. As much as it is about grief and loss felt by her parents, brother, and friends, it's about Alice coming to face to face with the thing that, she saw that night at Lake Mungo, the ghostly version of her own death. It terrified her. It's a heck of a build-up to that, because we hear, intercut into the footage from her phone, the session that she had with Ray about knowing something bad will happen, or that possibly already had happened to her, and it builds up to that crescendo that you realize she knew she was already dead. And it really kind of gives you chills. It's well put together, and it's kind of a perfect climax to this movie, because it wasn't like someone killed her at the dam or that there was some kind of conspiracy around Alice needing to die or whatever. Her death was fate, as it is for all of us. The only difference is there was something at Lake Mungo that brought her present and future together in one terrifying moment. And as I mentioned earlier, the movie is so engrossing and well conceived and well paced, you forget that there is a supernatural element. But it's so minor until you see the freeze-framed image of her own death staring at her, and by extension, at us. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload the stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next week, let's talk about Guillermo del Toro and comic book movies again. Yep, it's time I finally get to Blade 2. So until next week, stay spooky.